Hi. So oftentimes when I'm cutting up a log to make turning blanks, I'm cutting a log in half so that I sort of have the two halves to the log and the green kind of goes around. And I often think, oh, it'd be neat to cut or turn two basically bowl shapes and then put those back together again and make a sphere. And that sphere will be taken from the same place in a tree, and the rings and the green will kind of go together at least. So I finally have dried two bowl blanks that fit together like that. So the green, think they go this way. So the green kind of matches in this, and it's from the same section of the tree. So what I'd like to do is basically this project will be building the insert piece to go between the two because I need a little bit more height to make this a sphere. So I need to make a piece that's going to fit between the two. So and I thought instead of trying to hide that, maybe I celebrate that and I make that really the project with the two halves of the bowl on each side, or the sphere on each side.
I turned these two halves a little over 2 years ago. I think these are from my neighbor who was taking out a cherry tree. I actually labeled these A and B, thinking about making it a sphere at some point. I thought I could use the lighter maple wood that I got from my father-in-law a little over 2 years ago to make the insert piece. This is the same wood that I used on the Jingle Bell project recently. What I want to make this into are strips so I can cut segments from those strips. So I need to clean up these pieces as they're a little cupped and warped and the edges aren't straight. If I joint one face and one edge, I can run that face on the table saw table and run that edge against the fence and make a safe cut on the table saw and cut these into strips. And once I did that, I could plane all of the strips to the same thickness so that the segments will all be the same height. Then I can cut all of the segments, and I've been doing this a lot recently. Sometimes I like to clean up the little bit of fuzz on the edge of the cut on the segments. The desander is good for that. I can glue up all the segments. I think with these I'm doing kind of the same thing I've been doing where I glue up each quadrant and then glue the two halves together. So I want to be able to hold these rings down to the CNC table. I've got this idea of cutting the rim of the bowl and the rings into a radial pattern that will fit together and give sort of a segmented stepped pattern to the edge between the bowl and the rings. I've been wanting to sort of disrupt the parallel lines between the rings of segments in these segmented projects. So this was the first idea that I had about doing that. I need to hold the rings and the bowls down to the CNC table. So I am gluing tabs to the rings as hold down places on the CNC table. So while the rings and the tabs dry, I can work on the two bowl halves. I wanted to make the mortise round again in the bottom of the bowls so I could use the chuck again. Once the bowl was mounted on the chuck, I could work on the rim. My idea for holding the bowl on the CNC table was to hold it by the rim. What I needed was a vertical edge at the rim. It doesn't really need to be round, but that's going to happen just because I'm turning it on the lathe. But it needs to be perpendicular to the CNC table, or at least that would help with the hold down tabs. So I'm making the rim of the bowl perpendicular to the top of the bowl. And if I do that, I can make little tabs that I can clamp to the bowl and use to hold the bowl in place on the CNC table. I cut out the curve of the bowl into these tabs. And once I do that, it's a simple operation of clamping those tabs to the bowl. That will give me something to hold on to with the hold down clamps on the CNC table. So it all looks complicated, but it's a really simple idea. And it seems to work pretty well. So all of this was just to cut off the bottom of the bowl. And I really could have done this on the lathe, but I wanted a very flat and very parallel to the table cut on the bottom of the bowl. So this gives me something the bowl can sit on as I work on the rim. I can take the tabs off. As they're not glued on, they just come off. To hold the bowl the other way around on the CNC table, I was going to have to make tabs for that, but they were going to be a little bit more complicated, as I needed the tabs to hold the bowl at the rim, and that meant I needed some height. I needed a spacer piece between the tab that holds the bowl and the tab that the hold down clamp holds. So I made sort of a Z-shaped tab with a curved piece at the top to interact with the bowl and a foot at the bottom to be held by the CNC hold down clamps. Also, I was going to want to hold the rim below the very top of the bowl, as I was going to be cutting the top of the bowl, and I didn't want to cut into my tabs too badly. A little bit would be fine, as they're wood, but I didn't want to cut into them so much that they stop holding the bowl in mid-process. So I needed to cut my vertical surface a little taller on the bowl, so I used the shaper for that. You can see how these fancy tabs are going to work. They're sort of like flying buttresses. It's the same idea of clamping them to the bowl and then holding the whole system down to the table with the hold down clamps. Then I can work on the rim of the bowl. The first thing I wanted to do was to flatten the rim and to set this plane that it's cutting at the 0 point on the Z-axis. So I know that the end of the tool and this plane are exactly at Z0. Then I can cut my shape into the rim of the bowl, and it's just a radial step-down pattern. And as nothing's glued in place, it all comes apart. This cherry cuts really nicely. Cutting the other half was exactly the same process, but I did want the two halves to line up, or at least the grain on the two halves, so that it would appear as though they're taken from the same log in the same orientation. I also wanted the pattern that was going in between to kind of have a wave to it and to look like I was intentional about that pattern. The alignment of the second cut was important. So that's the second cut, and it looks like they're going to fit. I'm doing the ring, and it's exactly the same process as the rim of the bowl. I can flatten the top surface and get my Z set to exactly 0 at that surface. Then cut the same pattern into this ring. I made the pattern symmetrical so that the same pattern fits into itself. I wasn't going to try just yet doing some random pattern where I had two different halves that had to fit together. So I had figured out that with this bit, I needed 15 1/1000ths of an inch extra to make two pieces fit together. So the bit must be just the tiniest bit less than half an inch. So I added 7 1/1000ths of an inch to each of the two halves, and it still didn't quite fit. So I added 2 more 1/1000ths as a finishing pass, and that made the two halves fit together perfectly. Just snug enough that there's no gap, but not so tight that they don't come apart. And it makes me want to do a bowl like this, because it looks kind of cool. I like that the ring is starting to kind of carve itself into the monolithic section of the bowl. The glue up is straightforward, but it's just big, so there's just a lot of surfaces to get glue on. But in this process, I don't really need to be dainty with the glue, as all I'm really worried about is getting that seam tight. What's also nice is that the ring isn't sliding around on the top of the bowl, as there's really only one place for it to sit. So I can just clamp it together and it finds where it's supposed to be.
So I have the two halves made. I've made the rim piece and they seem to fit together, and I have the glue is dry. And I made a center, like sort of a spacer piece that I thought I might need. And when I measure the height, when they're like this, I don't have enough height, I think. I've got 11 inches on the outside on the rim of each bowl, but the height is only like 9.25 or something like that. So I really need to add some. And I was thinking I was going to need more than this, because I really need to get up to 11.
These go to 11.
But then looking at the shapes of these, I think I want the height to be just a little less, so I have a little more material to work on at the two ends. And I have some thickness on the inside of the rim. So I'm hoping this is a good glue up, and somewhere in there there's a sphere that I can get to where there's wood all the way around and I don't end up with a hole.
I like the look of it with the spikes coming out, but I need to cut them off as I'm going to turn this entire glue up and the tabs aren't needed anymore. I cut them off roughly with the bandsaw and then I sanded a little bit. I didn't really need to do this, but I thought it would make it look a little nicer. I can sand the top surface of the bowls and the ring to fit them together, just like a stack of rings would be in a segmented piece. I glued the spacer ring on first and clamped that in place and let that sit for 20 or 30 minutes or so. And then I could glue the other half of the sphere on. And I wanted to make sure the two halves were lined up correctly, both with the pattern of the insert and with the grain of the two bowl halves. With a little bit of pre-planning, it all seemed to work. Now it's the next day.
So I've left a little bit of the edge on this mortise for hopefully the chuck can hold that. And I can do the first turning.
And it seems to hold it pretty well in the chuck.
With that, as I need to shape this a little more into a sphere. It's a little bit long.
And I can start turning. First thing to do is to get it a little more round. It's pretty close, but kind of just smooth it over and kind of clean up the bumpy bits. Where the insert is, it turns really nicely because all of the grain is in the same direction. Most of what I need to remove at this point is at the two ends. The glue up as a whole isn't quite round, it's more kind of square if you look at it from the side. I found sort of what was the center. I worked on the other side. So you can see in the time lapse that I'm mostly removing the corners from the two ends and trying to get closer to a sphere. I made a cardboard cutout that I could put on it that helped a little bit in seeing where I needed to remove more material. Once I had it somewhat close to a sphere, I probably could have gone further at this point, but I was getting antsy to wanting to start the sphere cutting process. So I took the sphere off and I found a big cup that I had made, probably more as a jam chuck at some point. I don't think I've ever turned anything this big as a sphere. But I reshaped that and got it round, and I could use that as the drive side cup. The first time I put the sphere in was a little tricky trying to find where the center really was, but I got it pretty close. So that the trick at this point is to cut each axis and only cut off about half of the difference between round and what's sticking up. So you can kind of see here what I'm removing. And I want to remove about half of that space between the two arrows. I find also with this, I'm not watching where the tool is so much. I'm watching the top and what I'm removing of that space, as you can actually see what you're changing on the workpiece a little better than just watching the chips come off the tool. So each time I rotate the sphere and do a new side, I'm taking off a little less and a little less, and it's getting closer and closer to a sphere. What was tricky on this one was that I had two flat spots at the bottom of each of the original bowls where the mortise was for the chuck. After turning it now, I either should have made my spacer a little thicker, like I had talked about earlier, or even better, I should have made a round piece to fit into that void of the mortise. And I had the hold down tabs attached to the rim of the bowl, and I could have easily done this if I had known ahead of time the issue that I was going to have. So cutting down to those flat spots took quite a bit of the radius of the bowl to get down to, as you need to shrink the entire sphere to get into that hole. So what I ended up doing is I didn't want to hit the void in the center of the sphere, is I left one of them as a flat spot on the sphere, which I don't like so much because it's kind of not a perfect sphere, but it does give a flat spot for the piece to sit, so it doesn't roll around and it doesn't need a little stand. And the flat spot was right where I would have wanted a flat spot, so I can kind of rationalize to myself that it all worked out in the end. Once I had the sphere cut pretty close, I could start sanding. And this sanding is easy, but this one actually took a while as there was just a lot of surface area because the sphere was fairly big. Once I got down to the 220 sanding grit, I sanded the flat spot on the disc sander, just so that would be cleaned up a little bit. Normally I wouldn't use gloves at the disc sander, but the sphere being a sphere and kind of big and covered in sawdust, I needed something so I could actually grip the sphere and hold it. So I have some thin medical gloves that I use for finish that work pretty well for this. So I sanded through 1,000 grit, I think, and then I put finish on. And it looks really nice. I really like the idea. I think in the end it looks a little bit like the Pepsi logo, which I wasn't intending. But the geometric form of the insert against the organic grain is really interesting. I definitely want to do some more interesting rims on bowls by cutting into the two and fitting them together. Also maybe doing something with spikes. Thanks for watching.